Hello everyone. So today, just like I promised, I'm going to talk to you in this video about where we left off last time. Basically, what we were discussing was that there are different theories of development, and all of these different theories address or take some sort of stance with respect to the following questions, right? Or the following issues, really. So the first of which is that is development continuous or discontinuous? We will look at what that means when we discuss this question, right? The second is development more determined by nature or is it more determined by nurture, right? And the third of these questions is there one pathway to development for everyone? Or are there multiple pathways that are possible? Right? So all sorts of theories will take some sort of stance with respect to all three of these. So basically what that means is that if you have any theory that will try to answer this first question in terms of is development continuous or discontinuous, it will try to answer whether it's more driven by nature or nurture, and it will try to answer whether that particular theory believes if there is one pathway to development or multiple possible pathways, right? Now let's look at the first of these questions, which is development continuous or discontinuous? Now what does this exactly mean? Basically, when we say that development is continuous, right? What we assume is that a child, right, their way of interacting with the world, even if, whether you have a child or an adult, their basic way of interacting with the world is pretty much the same, right, as an adult's, right? The only difference is that an adult has more experience, right? Their abilities are more polished, right? And therefore, when we say that an adult, let's say, when they hear some kind of music, right, and they're able to recognize what that music is, right, and a child is not, right, or they're able to recognize that particular melody, right? Why is that difference there? So according to theories that emphasize on continuous pathways to development, will say that the child's perception of the music is the same as an adult's, right? The only difference here is that because the adult has more experience, right? That is why they respond to the melody differently, right? Hence, resulting in the difference, right? That's the basic, um, the basic point of difference, which is, the experience of it, right? So basically, researchers who follow a more continuous approach to development, right, they believe that, the way of interacting with the world is the same for adults and for children. The only difference is, the intensity of the reaction or, the quality of the reaction or the amount, right, of knowledge which is different, which makes, their reaction to the same sort of stimulus different, right? I hope that makes sense. So basically, what we're setting out with is that adults and children interact with the world similarly. So with children and adults, it's equal, the interaction, right? The number of skills that children set out with are the same kind of skills that adults set out with, right? However, the difference is that adults have more experience, they might have more skills because of, having being able to practice those skills. Again, that they have more experience with the world in interacting with the world. So basically, whatever difference that you see in adults and children is that of, perhaps the amount or the intensity of the reaction, right? But it's nothing more than that, right? When we contrast this with more discontinuous approaches to development, what we see is that with more discontinuous approaches, the premise is, or the assumption is, that at different points, right, what happens is that individuals gain a distinctive set of skills. Now, what does this mean? This basically means that we are saying that a 2-year-old may not be able to master the skills that a 4-year-old can. And the reason for that is not just that, there's a difference in age. The difference is that with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, you have something that is changing in terms of, in terms of what they are able to acquire. They're gaining something in skills, right? When they're 4-year old versus when they're 2-year-old, which is not just due to the experience that they've had with the world. It's because of certain qualities that they've gained because of gaining in age, right? This is best represented by this diagram that I will show you. And this is something that we saw earlier as well. So basically, this continuous development, right? It's like climbing a staircase, right? What we see here is that, when you have a baby who's just crawling, right? What we assume is that this baby is qualitatively different than the child here who is learning to walk, right? Something, development here has taken a very drastic turn, right? It's increased very, very drastically. And this is where we get this concept of stages, right? Basically, a stage is, a particular level at which there is a drastic change in development. And what we say is that each stage, so here when we have this stage versus when we have this stage, right, both of these stages, right, they have something that is qualitatively different to one another. What I mean is that there is something about the quality of the individual that is changing, right? What is happening is that as they climb up a stage, they are now able to acquire different skills that they were not able to when they were at an earlier stage, right? That is what it means. Contrast this now with continuous development. In continuous development, development follows a more gradual upward trend, right? Because what you assume is that the skills you set out with here are the same skills that you have at this stage and at this stage, right? Nothing is qualitatively changing. ऐसा नहीं हो रहा that when you hit this stage, you suddenly have this ability to acquire new skills. No, the ability to acquire these skills existed from the very get-go. What is changing here is, according to continuous, the researchers who believe in continuous development, is that you're gaining more experience, right? And because of that experience, you're able to hone the skills that you set out with. Whereas in discontinuous development, those skills are required at different stages, right? What this assumes then, discontinuous development, is that there are periods in which there is rapid transformation. So, for example, this period would be a period when there would be a rapid transformation, right? This period, whenever you're jumping from one stage to the other, that is a period of rapid transformation. Now, I hope that I've made this abundantly clear. If there are any questions, we will discuss them, right? Now, let's move on to the next question, which is basically, the question about nature versus nurture. Now, the debate about nature versus nurture is extremely pertinent to psychology. It's extremely important because, we have all of these different viewpoints about whether, it's your genetic endowment which is responsible for your behavior, or if it is nurture. And this has, a great many implications. Because if we say that it is your genes that are responsible for, let's say, your intelligence, then basically, your parents need not do much and you know, your intelligence will shine through. Whereas if it's nurture, right, if it's the environment that you receive, then those who provide that environment to you, or those who can change certain aspects of that environment, have a great responsibility. Because if they change the environment, that could mean that there could be some form of change in development. What that, simply, if we try to simplify that, what that means is that if you want a child that's intelligent and you believe that nurture has a role to play in, you know, in a in a trait, or in, something such as intelligence, you will pay much more attention to the environment that you provide to a child than if you believe that intelligence is wholly determined by genetic endowment, right? Let me show you a picture here. Right, so this is a picture of, me to the right here. This is me, right? And this is a cat I had when I was 2 years old. And this was, a cat that just found me, in the sense that nobody brought it in. It was a stray cat. And it just wandered in, and I took it in. And I started saying that this is my cat. And this is a picture of my 2 year old, she's not two yet, but yes, almost 2 year old daughter, with an almost identical cat, right? It's not the same cat. My cat died when I was 3, perhaps. And what I want to point out here is that, there is some sort of love or affinity for cats, right? Now, is this genetic, this affinity for cats, when we talk about me and my daughter? Or is this, because of nurture? Is it because of the environment that both of us received? Now, so is my daughter's love for cats determined by some specific gene that I have passed to her? That gene which is responsible for a love for cats, right? Or is it because growing up she saw me always, petting any cat that I came across, or because she saw that there were cats in the house? So which one do you think it could be? Right? So she basically had this exposure to cats. So that's again, a nature nurture debate, which, can sometimes not have a very definite answer. But yes, this again is a question that all developmental theories will take some sort of stance towards, right? Now let's come back to the third question, which is that, is there one pathway to development, or are there multiple possible pathways? Now basically, when we have one pathway, one possible pathway, so that means that we assume that development, for the most part, is going to be universal, right? For all humans, right? It's going to follow a universal kind of pathway in which people will develop similarly across the same, when they're the same age, pretty much, right? Versus when we say that there are multiple possible pathways, right? When we say that there are multiple possible pathways, we take into account what we term a context, right? So we recognize that people always develop in particular contexts, and those contexts can have an influence on your development, right? So refer back to what we looked at in the first video in which I was telling my own story. So I developed in a particular context in which, my father was a university professor, my mother was a homemaker, we lived always inside university campuses. So that was a particular context. If you think about your own development and the sort of home that you grew up in, you will realize that that was also a particular context. And that particular context then determines, your pathway to development to a certain extent, right? So this is basically what, the multiple possible pathways take on this sort of means, right? Whereas with one possible pathway, you have to have it universal for everyone, right? So yeah, so these are basically the three questions that we deal with. Now next, what we come to is basically an approach to looking at development, which is called the lifespan approach, right? So the lifespan approach is something that is that takes into account many of what we've looked at, all three. It tries to answer all three of the questions, but it takes a more balanced approach to all of these, right? The lifespan approach. What do we mean that it takes a more balanced approach to all of these? Now, the lifespan approach assumes certain things about development. First of all, it assumes that development is a lifelong process. Now, what does this mean? So initially, what theorists believed was that development starts at birth and then it ceases at adolescence, right? Now, with greater life expectancy, which basically means life expectancy means that, the number of years you can be expected to live, right? Now, as life expectancy has gone up, right? What we see is that people who are in their 50s, who are in their 60s, right, they learn all of these different skills. They might, want to sometimes, you also have this trend, let's say in the United States, where older people go back to college and complete a degree, or they learn a new skill, right? So, development really, then becomes a lifelong process. It doesn't stop at adolescence. What we see is that older individuals are also developing. And now what we see is that, with, for example, when you get married, that's another phase of development that was not something that was studied very widely earlier, during when developmental psychology was developing itself, right? So this is another thing that we sort of the lifespan approach takes into account, that development is not something that ceases at any particular point or at any particular age. Rather, it is a lifelong process, right? That only ceases when a person dies, right? So it only stops at death, right? What are some of the other assumptions? So some of the other assumptions are that development is multidirectional and multidimensional. Now, what does this mean that it's multidirectional and multidimensional? So, what multidirectional means is that you can be developing in one sort of field or in one sort of skill and sort of losing out on some other sort of skill. So now let's say that, in your university, you are offered a choice between learning French, right, and learning how to swim. And you pick learning French, right? So then what is going to happen is that your development in learning French is going to increase, or it's going to be more developed, right? Your ability to speak French will be developed, whereas your ability to swim will not be so developed, right? You will have compromised on developing in this field, right? So hence what this shows is that you can be developing in one area, whereas losing out on development in another area, right? In that essence, development is multidirectional, right? Uh, we, the other assumption is that it is multidimensional. What does multidimensional mean? Multidimensional means that there are different dimensions to development. So as you're growing, you might be becoming more mature, right? In the sense that you might be able to tackle emotions better. So basically, you might have better control of your anger, let's suppose, right? And it might be that as you're growing, you might have greater physical strength. So you might feel that with training, you can run greater distances as you're growing older, right? Another thing that you might feel as you grow older is that you're able to, let's say, make better decisions or calculate, let's say, something faster, right? You're able to, calculate figures faster. Now, basically, these are all different dimensions to development. So this we can sort of say is the emotional dimension. This we can say is the physical dimension, and this we can say is the cognitive dimension, right? So basically, there are different dimensions to development itself, right? This is what this assumption tackles, right? Then we come to the third assumption, which is that development is plastic. Now, what does this mean, that development is plastic? This basically what it means is that, no development is kind of set in stone, right? And that, let's suppose that we have a child who is extremely reserved because of certain childhood experiences that they have, right? They have become extremely reserved and they don't talk much. But as soon as that child, let's say, let's suppose that that child is in foster care. As soon as that child is adopted by a very loving family, right? And is given lots of love, right? It might be that they, you know, stop being as reserved or they stop being as quiet, right? And they open up somewhat, right? And they become slightly more talkative, right? So basically, what this shows us is that development is a plastic process, that it is something that is responsive to changing environments, right? So yes, so that assumption is also there in the lifespan perspective. Then the last assumption, which is that development is or development occurs, development is influenced, sorry about that. So yes, development is influenced by multiple interacting forces. Now, what does this mean? This sort of brings us back to what we talk about in context as well. But, let's look at some of these influences under this assumption. So this basically means that there are multiple interacting forces, right, that have an influence on development. Now, some of those factors are what are called age-graded factors. Now, age-graded factors might be biologically determined, but they are not always, right? So keep that in mind, that they might be biologically determined. So age-graded factors are basically things that are determined by what age you are at. Like, for example, mostly children begin to walk on their first birthday, right? So first birthday, and there's walking, right? Most individuals or most girls hit puberty when they are 11 years of age, or they have their first period when they are 11 years of age, right? So these are basically age-graded influences. There are others as well. Now, these are more biologically determined ones, but for example, there are others as well. For example, at what age you go to school. So let's say at 5 years of age, children are expected to go to school, right? There can be some others as well. For example, the age at which you get married. So all of these are age-graded influences, right? Then there is another category of influences, and obviously you can see that these influence development in different ways, right? Then you have something called history-graded influences. Now, history-graded influences are basically influences that influence development in terms of the time period that individuals are born into. Right? What does this mean? So let's suppose that a child who's born in 1990, right, will be different than a child who's born in 2020, right? So there's a lot of difference that's come between these two different times when we even consider something like technology. Nowadays, children have access to technology at a very young age, right? So basically, with history graded influences, it's the time period which is important in which particular individuals are born. And individuals who are born around the same time period are called a cohort. So let's say all individuals who were born in 1990 and around this time will be a cohort, whereas individuals who were born in 2020 or around 2020 will form another cohort, right? Now there's another set of influences as well, which are called non-normative influences. There's another category. Let's just go to the next page, huh? So these are called non-normative influences. Now, what exactly are non-normative influences? Non-normative influences, or basically those influences which are not normative. What normative means is something that applies to, a huge group of people. So non-normative influences are individual to each and every one of us, right? Let's suppose, for example, a non-normative influence on my life was the fact that my father was a professor, right? That, let me think of some more. So this video is about to end. Let us continue this in the next session, right?